Hi, this is Alan Perkins. Welcome to the Perkins Podcast. This is going to be part two of the college football playoff debate regarding Penn State and how they were left out of the playoff and whether or not that was fair. So I'm just going to be discussing both sides of that. But anyways, I'm Alan Perkins from Horns Digest. Welcome back to the Perkins Podcast. Don't forget to check out Horns Digest, where Chip Brown has 25 years of experience covering UT athletics. And please follow me on Twitter at Alan Perkins HD. That's ALLENPERKINS HD. I've also got a YouTube channel. If you just type in Alan Perkins HD in the YouTube search bar, my channel should be the first to come up, and it's got film study of Texas athletics for football. And I'll start putting some basketball analysis up there as well, where I'm just looking at clips of the game and talking about why something is done well or done poorly by Texas, and just looking at the players and how they're doing. So anyways, like I said, this is going to be part two of the college football playoff debate as to why Penn State should or should not have been included in the playoff. Right now it's Ohio State is in, Clemson is in, Washington is in, and Alabama is in the playoff, and it's the bowls have been set, as everybody well knows. And this is December 7th, Wednesday, 2016. And so I'm going to continue on. This is part two. And if you didn't listen to part one, you'll definitely need to, because I'm just going to jump right in to where I left off from part one. So looking at Washington now, Washington is, to me, where Penn State has the best argument against Washington if you're putting those two teams together as which one deserved to be in. Keep in mind, with Clemson, Ohio State, and Washington and their strength of schedule, particularly the out-of-conference schedule, because that's what they can control as far as scheduling. That's where Penn State has the biggest argument, to me, where Penn State could say that they felt that they should be in over Washington, even though Penn State has one more loss. So I'm going to tell you why. Number one, Washington lost at home, whereas Penn State lost both of their games on the road. Washington lost at home, and they lost by 13 points to a 3-loss USC team. Now, USC was hot at the end of the year, and they have been playing a lot better. So it's not a horrible loss, but it was at home, and it was, again, by 13 points. So that's a more significant margin than Penn State's loss to Pitt. But, of course, Penn State's problem is, again, that they lost by 39 points to Michigan. So, but here's the deal. Washington's out-of-conference schedule was so weak that that's where I have a problem with putting Washington in over Penn State. So Washington's out-of-conference schedule was Rutgers, Idaho, and Portland State. So obviously all three of those teams are pretty weak as far as college football goes in 2016, and generally any year, unless we're back in 2007, 2008 for Rutgers days or something. But that's the part that I have a problem with, because Washington was able to schedule a week out of conference, lose a game, and still get away with it, essentially. Whereas, say, TCU and Baylor a few years ago, especially Baylor, were punished for playing a very weak out-of-conference schedule. So I do think that there is something to be said. Like, for example, there were times in years past where an SEC team would have one loss, and that would be measured against other teams that had a loss, or sometimes were even undefeated throughout the course of the season. And the argument would be, well, that this SEC team has a loss, but they have a much tougher conference to play in. So, yeah, teams pretty much lose at least one game every year through that, just because it's such a tough slate. And other teams that are in weak conferences and that play weak out-of-conference schedules on purpose shouldn't be rewarded for that, or shouldn't be put in ahead of that SEC team because they played a lot of cupcakes and now all of a sudden they get to go to the championship game or the playoff, depending on what year you're talking about. That they just get in after they played a weak schedule. That's not fair to the teams from the SEC. And pretty much every single time the SEC got the benefit of the doubt in that aspect in the last, 10 years or so. Florida in 2006, for example, getting to play Ohio State, and then obviously that was proven correct, where Michigan didn't get the rematch with Ohio State. Alabama has won multiple national championships with one loss. The one that comes to mind the most is probably when Alabama lost to LSU at home 9-6 in overtime, and then played LSU again in the national championship game and thumped them. And Oklahoma State was undefeated all year, but then lost late in the season to Iowa State. And so obviously Alabama's loss was a better quality loss, losing to LSU back in that year. I think it was 2011, if I'm not mistaken. But Alabama's loss to LSU is much better than Oklahoma State's loss to Iowa State. But the problem was that, Alabama already got their shot, so maybe the BCS should have given Oklahoma State a chance just because Alabama had already had their chance. But when you looked at it just based on resume, it was clear that Alabama was more deserving. So in this situation, the College Football Committee talks about the best teams. That's the word they like to use. They don't use deserving. But to me, best team should also be deserving, because if a team is so great, they should win tough games, or tough games where they don't play so well, but they win anyways somehow, win ugly. But they should also blow teams out like Ohio State did, and like Penn State did, and like Washington did. Clemson was the only team that didn't blow teams out a whole lot this year. But Ohio State, Penn State, and Washington blew teams out all year. And that was the one thing going for Washington, is although the Pac-10 was weak, they blew teams out typically by 40 points a lot of times. So it's not Washington's fault that Oregon was down and USC was down to start the year and Stanford was down. Washington can't control that, but what they can control is the out-of-conference schedule. So to me, I don't think it would have been a horrible decision to put Penn State in over Washington. I think the key is that 39-point loss that Penn State had to Michigan that would cause me pause, but I don't think it's crazy, because at least Penn State won the toughest conference, if not one of the toughest conferences in college football this year, in the Big Ten, and they scheduled an out-of-conference game against Pitt, which is a reasonable opponent. Certainly better than Portland State and Rutgers that Washington scheduled. So to me, that's where Penn State had the biggest chance to make it in or make a jump. And obviously Washington finished fourth in the rankings, so clearly that's where the committee had it as well. And the committee did discuss how they had a difficult time deciding between the two teams. So, and obviously Clemson, Washington, and Penn State all won their conference championship, so they're equal in that way as far as measuring resumes. So let's see. And then the other thing, just a general observation about this whole process, is that most of the time when anyone is getting into a debate about which team is deserving or which team's the best team, usually when there's a lot of controversy, it's because a team lost. So I don't care if the discussion is about Penn State this year or Ohio State this year or Washington or Clemson or whoever. Any year that a team loses, that's their fault. Every team controls their destiny as far as at the beginning of the year for who they play, and the program and the coaches and anyone involved with the program control who they play out of conference. So somehow, some way, if a team is complaining but they've got a loss or two, it's still their fault, because if they would have just taken care of business like Alabama did this year, there wouldn't be any argument, especially with the BCS setup. And I'm sure at some point, especially with the playoff setup, the new CFP, I'm sure there's going to be a year down the road where maybe there's 4 undefeated teams, even though it's probably pretty unlikely, or 5 that come from the Power 5. That's going to be pretty amazing and mathematically unlikely, but it's possible. But generally speaking, all these arguments always happen after a team loses. If that team, whichever team you're hypothetically talking about, would have just won all their games, they wouldn't have a problem. So they only have themselves to blame in a way, because especially when you're talking about Penn State, because they put themselves in a position where they lost the only out-of-conference game that they scheduled that was a strong game. So they could have gained an advantage there from scheduling that team. They deserve credit for that, but they lost it. So they lose a chance to add that to their resume, and they lost by 39 to Michigan. So you just keep it close against Michigan. Maybe the committee looks at that differently, even though you have 2 losses. I don't know. But not only that, but if a team doesn't win decisively, and I don't care what the committee says, there's a difference between a 3-touchdown win and a 3-point win when the committee is splitting hairs in these situations. You know that they're looking at that stuff. And the only reason why they wouldn't be looking at a big, huge margin of victories if Team A is playing against cupcakes and winning by 40 or 50 points, they don't care about that. But if Team A is beating teams badly that are respected, or at least moderately respectable that year, that's going to make a difference instead of just winning a bunch of close games. So nobody forced Penn State to play Temple or Kent State out of conference. And they did a good job of scheduling Pitt, but they still lost. And really, like I said, even looking at Temple, I mean, Temple is a respectable team to have scheduled this year. It's not amazingly respectable, and of course it doesn't have the name power that other teams do, but Penn State, Temple had a good year this year, so that does look a little more impressive. But generally speaking, scheduling Temple, here's the deal, scheduling Temple year in, year out is not that impressive, and when a team schedules Temple, they're not expecting a tough game. So that's the point, is Temple has never been a power in football year in and year out, obviously. So that's really, Penn State really, in my mind, doesn't deserve a whole lot of credit for that, because that's a cupcake type game, and Temple just happened to be good the last 2 years. But when they scheduled it, they weren't. They were a doormat. So to me, that can't really be given a whole lot of credit. So let's see here. Okay, so the last thing I want to touch on is just the biggest thing that I liked about the committee's decision is that it awarded Ohio State for playing a tough out-of-conference opponent in Oklahoma, obviously a perennial power. And this is great for fans, because it means that other teams in the future will realize this and start scheduling tougher out-of-conference games, and that'll be great for the fans to watch better games instead of against cupcakes to open up the season. And they also said that conference championships basically aren't an automatic qualifier, which is a good thing, because there are circumstances where it shouldn't be that way. Think about Kansas and Missouri playing in 2007 for the Big 12 North Championship. Kansas didn't even play Oklahoma or Texas that year because of a scheduling setup, and they had a weak schedule all year, yet they almost made the Big 12 Championship. So there's situations where it's not fair or not sane to say, oh, conference championship automatically you get in. Teams will schedule weak teams out of conference because they're going to say to themselves, look, if our team wins, if the program wins all these games against out-of-conference teams that are weak, and the program wins the conference, the program will get in, the team will get in, because 4 out of 5 Power 5 conferences will get in if conference championships are an automatic qualifier. So that's not a good idea. It's not a good precedent to set. and it's not a good idea for fans because you're going to have a bunch of boring games early in the year. So I want to thank y'all for listening to the Perkins Podcast. I really appreciate it, and make sure you like, subscribe, and like I said, throw some comments out there on the YouTube channel and we can see what y'all think about all this. Have a great day. Bye.